Sisters and brothers, grace and peace to you from the God of our Lord Jesus Christ. Today's gospel story of Jesus cleansing the temple is one of the best stories from the story of Jesus. And the reason why I say that is not just because of personal reasons, but I say that because there are only a handful of stories that all four of the gospel writers told. This is one of them. But more than that, more than it just being one of the stories that the four gospel writers told, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it is also the only story from our Christian Testament that Jews also tell in their own synagogues. We remember Jesus as being the Messiah, but Jews remember Jesus as being the great reformer. He was the one that went to the temple and turned everything upside down. He helped reform it. And so I want to look at this story about, in some sense, what makes it one of the greatest stories ever told. And so when I just first look at the story of Jesus going to the temple, it's Passover, he heads to the temple, he sees all these animals, cattle and doves and sheep there, and there are money changers at their tables and money changing hands. And all of a sudden he starts shooing the cattle out and the sheep out, and he overturns the tables, and he tells people, "Get those doves out of here. You're turning my Father's house into a marketplace." And I'm thinking, okay, well, what would that mean? Does this mean that we're not supposed to sell Girl Scout cookies and Boy Scout sorts of materials anymore in churches? That those fundraisers for the band of salsa or candy bars, that we shouldn't do those anymore because that would be turning the church into a marketplace? Oh, and that rubbish sale that we have planned, does that mean we should cancel that? I don't know. But I got to ask you, does that sound like the greatest story you've ever heard? No. I think we need to dig a little deeper than that. So Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, and it was Passover. What's Passover? It's a great big party. It was one of the four big parties in the Jewish tradition. It still is. Maybe the greatest of the four parties, an annual, that people were encouraged, maybe even expected to go to Jerusalem and to the temple and to celebrate there in the temple. What's the temple? God's house. So in other words, it was 4 times a year, big party at God's house. Woohoo! And so the people went to Jerusalem for a big party. And there were, of course, at a party, you got to have food. And so, of course, lamb being Passover, you had to serve lamb. But people also showed up at the temple because they were there to confess their sins. So many times they used cattle or doves as sort of a payment with God, to help make their relationship right with God. And the lambs too. I mean, it was supposed to be a lamb at the Passover meal, one whose blood had been sprinkled on the doors or the eaves of the door. But Jesus, seeing all this, there was also the money changers, I should add too, because people were coming in from all over the world. And they didn't all use the same Jewish shekel. They had their Roman coins and their Greek coins and all of that. And they needed to change them because you could only use clean money in the temple. And so there were people changing their money. And Jesus says, "You're still making this a marketplace." Now, I did a little bit of digging on that word marketplace. It seemed like it was an important word, that Jesus was really riled up that this was a marketplace. And I noticed that in the stories, that really with Jesus, half the time, or many of the time, when Jesus is doing healing or something, he's in a marketplace. The people are bringing Jesus, those to be healed, the demons need to be cast out, they're in the marketplaces. And they bring him to Jesus there to be healed. But Jesus also talks about marketplaces in that, beware of the scribes. That it's there in the marketplaces. They like to put on a really big show. They like to blow their own horns to make themselves look important, to be called rabbi. But the reality is, they're just blowing smoke in your face. Look out for them. Beware of those marketplaces. But as I also read in Psalm 55, it says there, "Ruin is in its midst. Corruption, oppression, and fraud do not leave its marketplace." I think that's what Jesus was sort of getting at. It wasn't just simply that there was commerce going on, but there was oppression and fraud going on, that the money changers were gypping God's people and giving them a bad exchange rate. And the people were being forced to pay exorbitant prices for the cattle and the doves and the sheep. So that way then they might have a right relationship with God. People were being taken advantage of. In their grief and in their guilt, wanting to be right with God, the people were using them. And so I guess as I think about it, we're like, okay, well, maybe it's okay if we sell things in the church, but just make sure you don't gouge people, right? And Jesus chased the sheep and the cattle out of the temple, and so therefore we really ought to eat free-range cattle and free-range lamb, right? All right, maybe not. But it seems as though, all right, maybe that's a little bit more entertaining, but is that like the greatest story you've ever heard? No. We need to go deeper. We've been sort of trying to read this story with the left side of our brain. That's being reasonable and well, maybe a little bit on the superficial side. But God gave us a right side of the brain as well. A part of us that's used to using imagination and creativity, that uses images and metaphors, and dare I say, it forces us to use our emotions. Are we allowed to talk about our emotions in church? Sure! God gave us both sides of the brain. We got to use them both when we're reading Scripture. And so let's go back and say, what was Passover? It was more than a party. It was a celebration to remembering what God had done for God's people. That how God had rescued God's people from slavery in Egypt. They had been set free then to come to the promised land, to live and to experience the fullness of life that God intended for them. And the temple wasn't just simply God's house. It was built on a hill. No, it covered a hill, Mount Zion. But more than that, the sides of the temple were covered in gold plates. So that way when the sun shone on it, people from miles away could see the golden glow and say, look, there's the temple. There's where God lives. That, behold, the glory of God shining in our midst, in the midst of our city. And at nighttime, when there was no sun, they lit great fires, so the firelight reflected off the sides of the temple. And it glowed, and you could see it even farther away at nighttime. And people could say, there is that light in our darkness, the light that no darkness can overcome. When Jesus said to his disciples, do you put a light on a table and then cover it over with a bushel basket? No, you put it up high so people can see it. You put a city on top of a hill so that people can see it from miles away. People knew what Jesus was talking about because they had that image in their mind. Because they had seen the temple glowing in all of its glory from far away. But it was more than just simply the big, bright, shiny thing on top of a hill. To go into the temple was to experience a different world. It was not only that's where God was understood to live, but there was the smells and the sounds. It was a total experience. There was all of the cedar wood. Anybody have a cedar closet or something, or a cedar chest? How does it smell? Does it smell just like regular wood? No, it has a very distinct aroma to it that preserves things. It's a wonderful smell, assuming you're not allergic to it or something like that. But it was the smell and the touch, and to hear the people sing, and the people would participate in the liturgy. There wasn't just simply words that were being said. The whole idea is that people were participating in the worship of God before the throne of God. That the people who had gone before you were singing to God, and the people who were yet to come would be doing the exact same thing. To worship in the temple was to have an experience of the mystery of God. To know that you had entered a different world and touched a different reality. This was the temple. It was not just some sort of been to Disneyland, been there, done that kind of a thing. It was a full experience of the transcendent, of the mystery that we could never touch otherwise. We had seen the invisible God that we could not otherwise see. They had been to the temple. This was the center, the great experience. And Jesus walks in, and what does he see? There's all these animals everywhere. And they're being used for things that were not appropriate. But it says that Jesus took cords and he used them like a whip. And he wasn't just, come on, shoo, come on, little doggy, shoo. He pulled them out and was swinging them around and chasing out the cattle and He was angry. But it wasn't just an accident that Jesus pulled out cords to use them as a whip. If we remember the story of the Exodus, it was cords that were used to bind the Hebrew people in their slavery in Egypt. It was whips that the Egyptian overrulers used against them. Jesus had pulled out the cords. People were no longer bound. To put it another way, Jesus using the cords as whips was to say, this is a slave rebellion. We're not going to take it anymore. Now we're starting to get somewhere. Now this is starting to sound like a story that's the greatest story ever told. We got at least a Spartacus, right? This is at least a Hollywood movie. But it's more than that. Jesus took it to the next step when he said, get all of this stuff out of here. You're turning my Father's house into not a marketplace, a slave market. This is supposed to be a big celebration about how God's people have been set free, and you're turning it into a slave market. You're turning people back into the slaves that God set you free from in the first place. Why would you want to do that? I have come to set you free from all the ways that you are turned into slaves by this world. This is the good news for you. This is the greatest story ever told. But there's also a point in here that we can see a hint in this. There's a part of us that doesn't really want to hear this. There's also a side that says this is the greatest story never told. I mean, how many of you ever heard this story told this way before? Yeah, nobody. I hadn't heard it told this way either. But I was forced to dig deeper and deeper and deeper. Somebody made me actually do my homework, so to speak. And when I'm looking at that, I realize is that there is a part of us that does not want to hear this story. Because there's a part of us that knows that like those money changers and the people selling those cattle and sheep and doves that were making a fortune, that there's a part of us that, hey, I want to be one of those kinds of people. And Jesus coming along and disrupting everything, that's not what I want to hear. I want to see Jesus come along and not just simply turn the tables, but overturn the tables. See, I think that's the thing, is that Jesus doesn't turn those whips and cords on the people. He shoos out the cattle and the sheep and sends the doves out, but he doesn't send the people out. Jesus came to set us free in all the ways in which we are in bondage, including the ways that we think are actually the signs that we're free, that we're doing well and prosperous, but totally missing how we are hiding from the systems that we are trapped in. Be they economic, political, social, religious, family, you could name it, and they would go on and on. There's all these benefits that we get, but Jesus says that they still are enslaving us. That we are still trapped in them, that we still play the game, and we want to stay in it because we don't want to be left behind. And God says in Jesus, nobody's being left behind. I'm taking us all up together. We're all going to be free together. This wasn't about switching the tables and saying, aha, those who were oppressed now get to be on top, and those that were on top get to be oppressed. Jesus was turning over those tables and setting up a whole new way of being. It was a new day and a new way, and this was going to be something worth celebrating. This was a story worth telling, but there were those people that liked the old way. And they said, Jesus, who do you think you are? What sign do you give for us to do this? And Jesus said, tear down this temple. Tear down this marketplace, this slave market. Get rid of this abomination. And then, with a little twist that only Jesus could do, he says, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Now, living on this side of the resurrection, we know immediately that those 3 days sounds just like Jesus is in the grave and rising from the dead. But it's more than that. I think in some sense Jesus was saying, tear down the temple. Literally, it's no good any longer. If you're only going to make it into a slave market, how in the world is that going to be a house for God? It's not. It can't be. But Jesus was also saying, I am now the new temple. I am the one in which you now see the glory of God reflected in this world. I am the one that when you come to me and you touch me and you see me and you smell me and you taste me, you are now experiencing the mystery of God in human flesh. God with you. I am now the truth. I am the truth who will set you free. I am the light in the darkness that no darkness can overcome. Come, follow me, and we will be free. Because I'm the one who can lead you into that freedom. Now we know that 35, 40 years later, that temple was destroyed by the Romans. Anybody here happen to know what became then the central place for worship? The most sacred place in the Jewish tradition? It wasn't the synagogue. It was the dinner table in everyone's homes. Because that's where people gathered then. Not only to tell their own stories. I mean, that's where we get together, hopefully, to tell our own stories. What'd you do today, honey? What'd you do, kids? We tell the stories of our lives. But it's also the place where we learn to tell and to hear God's story. The greatest story ever told. Because that's how we help ourselves connect our life with God's life, with Jesus. It's how it's brought together. But Jesus knew this was going to happen, I think. Because we know that 3 days later, Jesus went and celebrated the Passover meal with his disciples. And he set a new table. And in that feast, and in that Seder dinner, yes, Jesus and the disciples tasted those bitter herbs that helped them to relive that time when they were slaves in Egypt. And they dipped the sop together in that salty water to remind them of their bitter tears that they wept in Egypt. But there was a point at which Jesus then took broken bread and he gave it to his disciples and said, "Take and eat. This is my body given for you. Do this to relive me." To relive me. It is again part of that ongoing, transcendent experience of the mystery of Jesus, of God in our lives, present now. And it is the same experience that would have been in the temple, with tasting and smelling and touching and feeling and hearing and seeing. All of that together. That was what we were called to be in. And then Jesus later took the fourth cup of wine, because, hey, this is a Jewish celebration, you got to have wine. But the fourth cup Jesus took from the cup of Elijah and said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, shed for you and for all people for the forgiveness of sin. Do this to relive me." When we come to this table in this church, or any church, and we hear those words spoken, those are the story being told to us again. The greatest story ever told. And so that we might be filled with this story. So that we might go out and not only go home and tell the story there and pass it on to our children and our grandchildren, to tell it to our parents and our great-grandparents and all of the generations that we live with, but in being drenched in God's story in Jesus. It is then that we might also likewise go out into the world, so that when people see us drenched in Jesus, they will see that there is something different about us, that there's a different smell about us, that we smell of Jesus, that we have this smell of rebellion, of turning tables over, that we have this feel about us, that there's something mischievous, that we're up to something, that people can see that there is something different about our lives, that we are not caught up in all the ways that society tries to enslave us, but that we are being set free. There is something freer about our lives that others say, "That's what I want to have in my life. How did you get that?" And you can invite them to come and experience the table, to experience the washing and baptism, so that people too might experience that indwelling of God's presence, of God's Spirit in their own lives. This is how we tell the story. This is the greatest story ever told. It would be really a shame for us to forget it, for it to become the greatest story never told. Amen.